Just when the West's finest tracker was about to close the book on the beast tearing apart a mining canyon, he discovered his target was a thinking, defenseless being, forcing a choice that would permanently turn him from the hunter into the hunted. His hardened heart cracked for the first time against the very innocence he was sent to destroy. The story of how one man went against the entire world reveals what truly separates a man from a monster. Hello everyone, and welcome. It's great to have you with us today. Let me know how you're doing and where you are tuning in from in the comments below. The dust of the Blackjaw Canyon had a taste all its own, a bitter mix of pulverized rock and broken dreams that coated a man's tongue within minutes. Silas knew that taste better than any man alive. He rode his steady mare not into a town, but into a raw scar gouged out of the earth, a mining camp that clung to the canyon floor like a desperate infection. Men with hollowed-out eyes and sweat-stained shirts stopped their work to watch him pass, their silence a testament to his reputation. They didn't know his name, not most of them, but they knew the look of a man who was an ending to someone's story. Silas was 60 years old, with a face mapped by sun and sorrow, but his body still held the rigid strength of the mountains that had been his only home. He dismounted in front of the largest tent, a structure that reeked of stale whiskey and ambition. A man stepped out, wiping grease from his hands onto his trousers. This was Barrett, the foreman. His face was a patchwork of old scars, one eye milky and blind, the other sharp and predatory. He looked Silas up and down, a flicker of something between respect and disdain in his gaze. He didn't offer a handshake. Men like them dealt in currency, not pleasantries. "You're him, then." Barrett's voice was gravel, worn down by shouting over the clang of machinery. "The tracker." Silas gave a slow single nod. "I am." Barrett gestured him inside. The tent was hotter than the canyon itself. Maps were pinned to a makeshift table, weighed down by rocks and a half-empty bottle of bourbon. "I'll keep it simple," Barrett started, skipping any pretense of hospitality. "Something is coming down from the high ridges at night. It's not a bear, not a cougar. It's big, and it's smart. It's tearing our drilling equipment apart, bending steel girders like they're dried twigs. The men are spooked, talking about demons." Silas walked over to the canyon mouth, looking downriver. The water, which should have been clear and lively, flowed thick and gray, coated with a greasy film from the mining operation's runoff. A line of dead trees marked its toxic path. He'd seen this a dozen times before. Men came, tore the land apart for what was underneath, and left a corpse behind. It was the way of things. He turned back to Barrett, his face unreadable. Barrett followed his gaze and scoffed. "Don't get sentimental on me, old man. That's the price of progress. My problem is the thing in the hills. I want you to track it and eliminate it. I don't care what it is. I want it gone." He slid a heavy pouch of coins across the table. "This is half. You get the other half when the job is done. Double the usual rate." Silas picked up the pouch. The weight felt familiar, solid. He wasn't a man driven by greed, but by a need for solitude, and solitude cost money. He looked past Barrett, at the ravaged landscape, then at the foreman's hungry eyes. There was no thrill in this for him, no hunter's excitement. There was only the quiet calculus of a job to be done, a weariness that had settled deep in his bones years ago. He had a feeling this job would settle even deeper. Dawn broke not with a gentle glow, but as a sharp, blinding blade of light across the canyon rim. Silas was already gone. He'd left the suffocating camp behind before the first miners started their coughing fits, preferring the clean silence of the high country. He ignored their fearful whispers as he went. Fear was a noise he had learned to tune out decades ago. His work began where their courage ended. He started at the site of the latest destruction, a massive steam drill twisted into a sculpture of scrap metal. The tracks were immediately deeply wrong. They were huge, larger than any grizzly he had ever trailed, but the shape was the first unsettling detail. There were 5 distinct toes and a clearly defined arch. It was the print of a bare foot, impossibly large, pressed deep into the hard-packed earth. Silas knelt, running a calloused thumb along the edge of the impression. The creature's weight was immense, yet the stride between the prints was long and even, suggesting not a lumbering beast, but a being that moved with purpose. He followed the trail away from the camp, up into the rocky terrain that the miners avoided. The path was not random. The creature knew this land, using game trails and natural shelters to conceal its passage. A few hours into the track, he found the second piece of the puzzle. It was a bear trap, one of Barrett's, its steel jaws thick enough to snap a man's leg in two. But it hadn't been sprung. The trap had been dismantled. The retaining spring was bent into a useless curve, and the jaws themselves had been pulled apart, the steel warped and torn at the hinge. Silas stood over the ruined trap for a long time, the morning sun warming the back of his neck. A bear would have been caught, would have thrashed and bled, and maybe even chewed its own leg off to escape. A bear would not have possessed the dexterity or the cold logic to simply break the machine. He was tracking something that didn't just have strength, but an intelligence that could comprehend a mechanism. It understood the trap for what it was, and had neutralized it with contemptuous ease. His professional curiosity, the cold fire that had driven him for 40 years, was slowly being replaced by a heavy, profound sense of dread. This was no beast. He was hunting something else entirely. The trail led him higher, away from the familiar dusty browns and grays of the mining canyon, and into a maze of weathered red rock. It was a path no one from the camp would have ever found, a route that seemed to lead to nowhere but impassable cliffs. Yet the tracks continued, guiding him through a narrow fissure in the rock face he almost missed. He squeezed through, his leather pack scraping against the stone, and what he found on the other side made him stop dead. The air changed instantly. It was cool and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. He had stepped into a hidden valley, a perfect bowl of green, shielded from the outside world by towering walls of rock. A crystal-clear river, the same one the mine was poisoning downstream, flowed through the center of it, pristine and alive. The contrast was staggering, like stepping from a graveyard into a church. This place was untouched, a secret garden in the heart of a dying mountain. And then he saw it. Across the valley, near the riverbank, there was movement. He instinctively raised his rifle, his eyes squinting to make out the shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, and standing upright. It was not a beast. It was a figure, clad in what looked like stitched hides, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. It was a woman. He watched, frozen, as she knelt by the water. She was a giantess, a being that should have only existed in the tall tales of prospectors driven mad by sun and solitude. Her hair was a long, dark mane, and her features, even from this distance, were clearly defined. She moved with a strange limp, favoring one leg as she gathered something from the riverbank. There was no menace in her posture, only a quiet, weary diligence. Silas slowly, mechanically, lowered his rifle. The weight of the weapon in his hands suddenly felt obscene. Every instinct he had, honed over a lifetime of tracking, every rule of the hunt, evaporated in that single moment. The contract, the money, Barrett's demands, it all became meaningless noise. The world he knew, a world of clear targets and simple objectives, had just cracked down the middle. This job was not just more complicated than he thought. It was impossible. For a man who had lived his life in the quiet company of mountains, Silas understood that the most important conversations required no words. He made his decision. Leaving his rifle propped against a boulder, a clear sign of non-aggression, he stepped out from the cover of the rocks and began walking openly across the valley floor. He didn't rush, his movements calm and deliberate, giving her all the time in the world to see him coming. She saw him. Her head snapped up and her body went rigid with tension. She stood to her full, incredible height, and for the first time Silas felt a tremor of pure primal fear. She towered over him, a true daughter of the stone and the pines. But he kept walking, his hands held open at his sides. He stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to see the details of her face. A strong jaw, high cheekbones, and eyes the color of moss and ancient sorrow. There was no aggression in those eyes, only a deep, guarded weariness. She had seen men before. He saw the source of her pain, Wrapped around her lower leg was a crude bandage of leaves and mud, but beneath it he could see the angry, inflamed flesh where the steel jaws of Barrett's trap had torn into her. He met her gaze and slowly, deliberately, pointed first at his own leg, then made a motion with his hands like a trap snapping shut. Her eyes widened slightly in understanding. Then he turned and pointed back in the direction of the poisoned gray river, his expression one of grim acknowledgement. A silent question and a statement in one. They did this to you. I know why you fight them. She watched him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling in a slow, deep breath. Then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was an answer, an agreement, a conversation held in the universal language of shared grievance. In that instant she ceased to be a target, a quarry, or a monster. She was the last guardian of this sacred place, and he was the trespasser who had come to hunt her. He saw the world through her eyes, the encroaching noise, the foul water, the relentless destruction. He saw not a beast, but a defender, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his very soul, that he could not, would not be the one to harm her. The sun was bleeding across the western sky when Silas walked back into the stench of the mining camp. He moved with the same deliberate pace as always, but inside a storm was raging. He had spent a lifetime valuing the simple truth of the trail, the honesty of a footprint in the dirt. Now he was about to build a wall of lies. Barrett was waiting for him outside the main tent, pacing like a caged animal. The foreman's one good eye zeroed in on Silas, searching for blood, for a trophy, for confirmation of a job done. Well, Barrett's voice was sharp, impatient. Is it done? Where's the proof? Silas stopped and met his gaze without flinching. His own voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a practiced mask he had worn for years. It's gone, he said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. Tracked it clean over the North Ridge. It was a big one, bigger than I thought. But it's moving fast. It won't be back. This territory is spooked for it now. Barrett stared at him, his jaw tight. He was a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was screaming that something was wrong. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, suspicious growl. You're sure about that, old man? You've been out there all day. You never come back empty-handed. Never. Well, there's a first time for everything, Silas replied, his tone unchanged. He held out his hand. The rest of the payment. For a moment, it seemed Barrett would challenge him, call him out. The air crackled with unspoken accusation. But Silas's reputation was a shield. To call him a liar was to call the mountain itself a liar. Gritting his teeth, Barrett pulled another heavy pouch from his belt and slapped it into Silas's palm. Fine. Get your things and be gone by morning. Silas nodded once, turning away without another word. He walked to his small pack, the weight of the coins feeling heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He wasn't just taking money for a job he didn't do. He was taking blood money to fund a betrayal. He knew this lie was a fragile dam against a flood of greed and violence, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that it wouldn't hold for long. Darkness fell on the canyon like a shroud, but Silas did not ride north. He waited until the drunken shouts from the camp faded into snores, and the last campfire dwindled to embers. Then, under the cold light of the stars, he slipped away, not as a departing tracker, but as a returning conspirator. He moved back toward the hidden valley, his pack now filled not with tools of the hunt, but with supplies. He had traded a portion of Barrett's gold in a dusty outpost miles away for clean bandages, carbolic soap, and a small tin of potent healing salve. He reached the fissure in the rock and entered the quiet sanctity of the valley. He didn't approach her dwelling directly. Instead, he found a flat, sheltered rock near the path she took to the river each morning. There, he placed the supplies, neatly wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. It was a silent offering, an apology and a promise. He retreated to a high ledge overlooking the valley, a spot where he could watch without being seen, and settled in for a long vigil. For several days, this became his new life. He was no longer a hunter, but a guardian. He watched her from his perch, learning the rhythms of her solitary existence. He saw her tend to her small garden of mountain herbs. He watched her carefully mend the wound on her leg with the supplies he had left. He saw her stand by the poisoned river that bordered her home, her posture one of profound, silent grief. She was not a mindless destroyer. She was a keeper, the last of her kind, perhaps, fighting a desperate losing battle against a world that didn't even know she existed. A strange, unspoken bond formed across the distance. Sometimes she would look up towards his hiding spot, not with suspicion, but with what seemed like acknowledgement. She knew he was there. The hunter had become the sentry. He was protecting her from the world he belonged to, and in doing so, he was severing the final threads that tied him to his old life. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known for 30 years. A clean, sharp feeling that cut through the weary cynicism that had been his only companion. He was no longer just Silas, the tracker. He was the keeper of a secret as old as the mountains themselves. Back in the camp, progress had stalled, and the mood soured with each passing day. A small rock slide had blocked a promising new tunnel, and 2 men had broken bones trying to clear it. The men were restless, their fear of the beast replaced by the familiar grumbling of unrewarded labor. Barrett's patience, thin on the best of days, was worn down to a raw nerve. The story Silas told him felt wrong, an ill-fitting boot that pinched with every step. The camp's failures felt connected to the tracker's lie, a lingering curse. The proof he needed came from the dirt. While pacing the camp's perimeter, his one good eye scanning the ground for anything out of place, Barrett found it. It was a small, tightly woven bundle of river vine, half hidden under a sagebrush. It was the kind of intricate knotwork a mountain man might use, but the vine itself was a vibrant green, a type that only grew near clean, running water. It didn't grow anywhere near the polluted sludge of their canyon. He had seen Silas fiddling with just such a vine before he left. It was a loose thread, and Barrett was a man who pulled on loose threads until everything unraveled. His next stop was the tent of a young, nervous miner who had been on watch the night Silas left. Under Barrett's intimidating glare, the boy's story crumbled. He admitted he'd seen the old tracker's silhouette against the skyline, heading back east towards the high peaks, not north toward the open plains. The lie was exposed. The pieces clicked into place with grim finality. That evening, Barrett gathered a handful of his most desperate and ruthless men who valued a bonus more than their own safety. He uncorked a bottle of whiskey and let it pass between them. "The old tracker lied to us," he snarled, his voice a low growl that cut through the evening air. "The beast is still out there, and I'll bet my stake in this whole damn operation that it's guarding something more than just rocks." He let the implication hang in the air, heavy with the promise of gold or some other hidden treasure. "We're going after it, and we're going to take whatever it's protecting. As for the old man," he paused, a cruel smile twisting his scarred lips, "we'll take his head as a bonus." From his vantage point, Silas saw the telltale signs long before they reached the valley. A flicker of torchlight against a distant rock face. The faint, angry shouts of men fueled by whiskey and greed. He had known this moment was coming. His lie had been a finger in a dike, and now the flood was here. There was no more time for quiet observation. The time for hiding was over. He moved faster than he had in years, scrambling down the rocky incline with the agility of a man half his age. Fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but it was not for himself. It was a fear he hadn't felt since he was a young man, raw and selfless. He reached the valley floor and ran, his boots pounding against the soft earth, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He had to warn her. He found her by the river, a still, powerful silhouette against the moonlight. She had already heard them. She was standing perfectly still, listening to the approaching threat. He skidded to a halt before her, his chest heaving. He didn't have the words to explain, but he didn't need them. He pointed frantically back the way he had come, his gestures sharp and desperate, mimicking the raising of rifles and the angry faces of the men. He tried to urge her to run, to flee deeper into the mountains where they couldn't follow. But Naya did not move. She looked down at him, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but a deep, unyielding resolve. This was her home. She had retreated as far as she could. There was nowhere else to go. Instead of running, she bent down, and with a grunt of effort wrapped her powerful hands around a massive, half-buried boulder. With a surge of incredible strength, she tore it from the earth and held it at her side like a shield. She would not run. She would fight. And in that moment, Silas knew he would too. He pulled the worn Winchester from his shoulder, felt the familiar solid weight of the stock, and chambered around. The sharp, metallic click echoed in the sudden silence of the valley. He stood beside her, a weathered old man and a gentle giant facing the oncoming tide of a lesser world. They were one now. Barrett's posse stumbled into the hidden valley like a pack of clumsy coyotes, their torches cutting ugly, flickering gashes in the pristine darkness. They were loud, overconfident, and unprepared for what awaited them. They expected a cornered animal. They found a fortress defended by a ghost and a giant. As they entered the narrow mouth of the valley, the first shot cracked from the darkness above. It wasn't a killing shot. Silas wasn't an executioner. The bullet ricocheted off a rock just inches from the lead miner's head, sending stone chips flying and the man scrambling backward with a yelp of terror. Confusion erupted. The men fanned out, firing blindly into the shadows. Silas used his intimate knowledge of the terrain, moving from rock to rock like a phantom. He was a master of this land, and he turned it into a weapon. A well-aimed shot sent a precariously balanced rock tumbling down, scattering the men. Another took out the lantern one of them was carrying, plunging a section of their line into disorienting darkness. He was not trying to kill them, but to break their nerve, to make them understand they were trespassing in a place far deadlier than they imagined. Then Naya responded. A roar, deep and guttural, erupted from the center of the valley. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the sound of a heart breaking with fury, a sound of pure, righteous rage that shook the very stones. The miners froze. Their drunken courage evaporated, replaced by the primal fear their ancestors had felt huddling in caves. They finally saw her, a towering silhouette against the moonlit sky, and the sight shattered their greed-fueled fantasies. This was no simple beast. This was a titan. Barrett, however, was immune to awe. He saw only an obstacle. "Fire! Fire at will, you fools!" he screamed, raising his own pistol and firing. The bullet sparked harmlessly off the boulder she held. Spurred by their leader, the men overcame their fear and unleashed a volley of gunfire. The peaceful valley was transformed into a war zone, the air filled with the deafening roar of rifles, the splintering of rock, and the pained, furious cries of the valley's last defender. The battle for this last patch of untouched world had begun in earnest. The chaos of the fight was a whirlwind of noise and shadows. Silas felt a searing pain rip through his shoulder as a stray bullet grazed him, but he barely registered it. He kept moving, reloading, and firing, his actions a grim, efficient dance of survival. He was no longer just a man with a rifle. He was an extension of the valley's will to live, his every shot a defiance against the intruders. His goal was to disarm and disable, to create enough chaos to force a retreat. Naya was a force of nature unleashed. Enraged by the attack on her home and the sting of bullets grazing her tough hide, she moved with devastating power. She didn't attack the men directly, but the environment around them. A sweep of her arm sent a young pine tree crashing down, blocking their path. She hurled rocks the size of barrels, not at the men, but in front of them, forcing them to scatter and break formation. Her fight was a terrifying, defensive display of power, a desperate attempt to drive the invaders out. In the midst of the pandemonium, Silas saw Barrett breaking away from the main group, a stick of dynamite in his hand, its fuse already lit. He wasn't aiming for Naya. He was running towards the mouth of her cave, her home. In a flash of cold clarity, Silas understood his plan: seal her in, trap her, and finish this. Forgetting his own safety, Silas broke cover and charged, slamming into Barrett with the force of a battering ram, just as the foreman was about to throw. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The dynamite flew harmlessly into the river, extinguishing with a hiss. This was no longer a gunfight. It was a brutal, personal brawl. Fists flew, connecting with the sickening crunch of bone and gristle. "She was just living here. She didn't need anything from you," Silas roared, his voice raw with a fury he hadn't felt in decades. Barrett, his face a mask of blood and hatred, spat back. "The whole world is for us to take, and anything that stands in the way gets crushed." He pulled a knife, its blade glinting in the torchlight. But years of hard living had made Silas tough and wiry. He met the attack, twisting Barrett's wrist until the knife clattered to the ground. He was older, but he was fueled by a righteous cause. Barrett was fueled only by greed. And it wasn't enough. A final desperate punch from Silas sent the foreman sprawling, defeated and humiliated at the feet of the very being he had tried to destroy. The sight of their leader, broken and unarmed on the ground, shattered the last of the miners' resolve. The fight went out of them, replaced by a desperate scramble to survive. They turned and fled, dragging their wounded with them, their panicked retreat a pathetic end to their violent invasion. They disappeared back through the fissure in the rock, leaving only the scent of gunpowder and their own fear behind. Silence descended upon the valley, a heavy, ringing quiet that was more deafening than the battle itself. The ground was scarred, littered with spent cartridges and the debris of the fight. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood. Victory felt nothing like triumph. It felt like a deep, ragged wound. Silas pushed himself to his feet, his entire body screaming in protest. His shoulder was on fire, and he could feel the warm stickiness of blood soaking his shirt. He looked over at Naya. She was standing over the cowering form of Barrett, her massive chest heaving. She had several bleeding wounds on her arms and side, but she seemed to pay them no mind. She raised a hand the size of a small boulder, and for a second Silas thought she would crush the foreman where he lay. Instead, with a low groan that sounded more like sorrow than anger, she simply turned away and let him be. Silas stumbled towards her, his rifle hanging limply in his hand. Their eyes met across the scarred battlefield. He saw the pain in her gaze, but also a flicker of gratitude. The cost of this victory was written across the landscape of their home. As his strength finally gave out, and the world began to spin into darkness, he saw her step towards him. Her enormous, gentle hands reached down, and she lifted him from the ground as if he weighed nothing at all. She carried him towards the safety of her cave, a wounded guardian carrying another. They had won, but they were both broken, the last two defenders of a world that was rapidly vanishing. A year passed. The seasons turned, washing the scars of battle from the hidden valley. The Blackjaw Canyon mining operation collapsed not long after the disastrous raid. The official story was a mix of rock slides and financial trouble, but the men who had been there that night spoke in hushed, fearful whispers of a vengeful mountain spirit and its devilish protector. The camp was abandoned, and soon the wild grasses began the slow work of reclaiming the blighted land. The legend of Silas, the tracker who walked into the mountains and never came out, became another ghost story told around campfires across the territory. But Silas was not gone. He was home. He never fully recovered from his wounds. A permanent limp became a constant reminder of that night. His hair, once iron gray, had turned completely white. Yet, in his eyes, there was a piece that had been absent for 40 years. He lived in the valley with Naya, no longer a guest, but a permanent resident, a fixture of the landscape like the ancient pines. He had become the valley's keeper. Their lives settled into a quiet rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. He helped her tend her garden. She, in turn, learned to understand his needs, bringing him fresh fish from the now cleansing river. They never spoke a word of English, but they communicated perfectly. Their language was one of shared glances, simple gestures, and a profound mutual respect. He was the last remnant of his world, and she was the last of hers. Two solitary souls finding companionship in their shared exile. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, Silas would climb to the ridge overlooking the valley. He would sit there for hours, watching the distant empty plains of the world he had left behind. He had lost everything that once defined him, his reputation, his name, his place among men. But as he looked back at the peaceful valley, at the towering gentle figure of his only friend moving by the river, he knew he had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found his purpose. He had been hired to kill a monster, and in the end, he had simply found his way home. The legend of the Mountain Devil and its silent, watchful guardian was just beginning.